guys, welcome to Shenanigans with Shreya. I am in my university podcast studio, which I have been low-key fangirling over. So there's this really fun soundboard that I'm working with right now. Shout out to Rode Soundboard, Rodecaster. Let me give you guys an example. Yeah, I low-key used all of these effects. It's so fun to be working in a studio. I would usually have the lights on, but I'm gonna record this in this cool lo-fi vibe. So yeah, welcome to today's episode from a new location, probably going to be my permanent location for at least the year. I wanted to start off by saying that I feel like I've gotten into the groove of the podcast, of, editing and figuring out ideas. There are so many fun things out there. I wanted to also share at the start of every episode a fun piece of neuroscientific research that I have come across because there's so much happening in the brain research space. So today's fun research fact is regarding schizophrenia. So for context, schizophrenia is a very difficult disease to live with, to diagnose, a range of symptoms. So positive, negative, and cognitive symptoms. Positive symptoms would be things like hallucinations, and negative symptoms would be feeling really isolated, being withdrawn socially. And then cognitive symptoms would be that you have trouble being attentive and focusing on things. We don't even know why certain people have schizophrenia. It's so multifactorial. So it could be genetics, it could be environment, it could be lifestyle. And another reason why it's really difficult to diagnose is there seems to be a lack of proper biomarkers. So biomarkers are something that would be affected by a disease. So for example, in Alzheimer's disease, very popular biomarkers would be the tau and amyloid proteins, because high levels of tau essentially means that, okay, Alzheimer's is there. But schizophrenia doesn't really seem to have anything per se that would make it very obvious that, okay, this is schizophrenia, which makes it very difficult to diagnose this in people. And it's almost like a guess game. I had a lecturer in my undergrad, loved his classes. He taught one of my favorite modules, actually. It was all about mental disorders. And we spent a lot of time on schizophrenia. And I remember him telling us that a lot of the times when people with schizophrenia go in to see a therapist, a counselor, trying to give this diagnosis that, okay, you might have schizophrenia, it's literally like a hit or miss. They will look at the symptoms. They might think it's something else like bipolar disorder. And even if they do manage to narrow it down, okay, hey, maybe it is schizophrenia, they might give hormone balancing medication, so for example SSRIs, but again, hormone imbalance might not be the reason that someone is schizophrenic. So they give this medication maybe for 4 to 6 weeks and then check how the patient's doing. If the medication works, that's good, but a lot of the times the medication won't do anything and the symptoms would have just worsened. So it's almost like you waste time as the condition progresses. The reason why I'm bringing this up, and as we were saying that there's no blood test, there's no brain scans, there's no biomarker available for this, a research study in the University of New South Wales in Sydney has found out that schizophrenic people can have different wavelengths based on their inner and outer voice. So for context, when we listen to something outside of us, so for example, someone's talking to us, you're listening to music, we have our auditory stimulus light up, our brain reacts. There's wavelengths that can be measured with EEG, which you might have seen the caps with those electrodes in them. It's quite a non-invasive technique. Our brain will respond actively to the stimulus, so it will increase its activity. But if, say, you're in silence and you're asked to speak internally, what we mean by that is to have our inner voice speak. If you just listen to your inner voice without external stimuli, your brain activity actually reduces, which means that there's not a lot of stimulus outside of you. It's essentially just within you. But the study in Sydney has found that schizophrenic people are not able to differentiate between an inner voice and an outer voice. So yes, when they're listening to external stimuli, their brain wavelengths will be very reactive. They will increase their brain activity. When they're talking internally, listening to their inner voice, their brain mistakes that as external stimuli. So the brain activity increases again, even though there is no external stimuli. So it's almost like they confuse their inner voice as an external voice, which makes sense in the condition as well, because a lot of times patients might think they're hearing voices, hallucinations, delusions, that kind of thing. So they're not able to differentiate literally like on a biological level whether this voice is their own or an external stimuli. This research study is really interesting, and I'd say it's really cool to see that we might be able to have some sort of indicator now with schizophrenic patients where different wavelengths might be able to differentiate that someone has schizophrenia. There is no cure for this disease, which again, so difficult. It's nice to have a biomarker to develop these therapies around. The study has essentially shed light that there's a potential biomarker in terms of brain wavelengths, which is this episode's neuroscientific fact. So yeah, Now, coming on to the main episode, I wanted to talk about the art of awkwardness. I genuinely wanted to know why we feel the whole aspect of being awkward. And recently this year, I wanted to start owning it more and try to think to myself that, awkwardness is a brain construct. It's just me and my brain making things worse in my head than they actually are. Being awkward or feeling awkward is a very universal experience, and I wanted to know what the science behind this is, what research in brain and behavior had to say about this. So I wanted to talk a little bit about how the structure of the brain changes, essentially, how our brain perceives awkwardness on a literal biological level, psychologically, how we perceive awkwardness. So the definition of awkwardness that I came across is awkwardness is a complex emotion with both biological and psychological roots, triggered by social missteps that activate a primitive social survival response. Social survival response is very interesting in this definition because digging deeper, what parts of the brain are being activated by being awkward or being in an awkward situation, the parts of the brain that really work together are the anterior cingulate cortex and the insula. They are basically the parts that are processing, oh my God, this human is feeling awkward. And these parts work in tandem to trigger a fight or flight response. And we have a part of the nervous system called the sympathetic nervous system, which controls the fight or flight response. So what that means is that if you're triggering your fight or flight response, you're going to have literal symptoms in a physical way. Like you might start sweating, you might have an increase in heartbeat, you might be incredibly self-conscious and even more aware of yourself in that particular situation. I also found out this really interesting piece of information that awkwardness activates the same part of the brain that pain does. So what that literally means is, number one, if you broke a bone or, you stubbed your toe, and number two, you're in an awkward situation, both of these events activate the exact same neural pathway, which is something that a research study from University of Michigan has concluded. I just think that's insane that we consider awkwardness and pain on the same level biologically. Now, psychologically, awkwardness essentially indicates that you are aware of what's socially acceptable, what the social norms are, and your awkwardness is essentially your brain telling you that you did something that's kind of outside of what is socially acceptable in terms of social behavior. It doesn't have to be something illegal, but for example, shaking someone's hand for too long might be a bit awkward. Having intense eye contact with someone might be a bit awkward. These are just not social cues that we as a general society grow up with. So being awkward essentially just means that you're more aware of social behavior and how people are meant to present themselves. Another question that might arise in terms of the scientific perspective might be, how do we measure awkwardness? Is there a way that we can actually calculate how awkward a person is or how awkward someone who's genuinely dealing with something distressful is? So there's a psychologist called Shreya. He has a book called Awkward, The Science of Why We're Socially Awkward and Why That's Awesome. And in this book, he essentially states that there is a way to measure awkwardness, which is using the autism spectrum inventory, which I thought was really interesting, that awkwardness would be measured using something that is meant to measure autism. In a way, it does make sense because some of the things that autistic people do tend to struggle with is communication. So in this inventory, you have 26 points. 26 points would be an autism diagnosis, essentially. And anything that's between 16 and 26 is what we think awkwardness is. So Shreya, the author of this book, he essentially says that awkwardness is just social inconsistency, which is why we can use the autism spectrum inventory. Coming back to social norms, you feel more awkward if you are with someone you don't know. So with strangers, you're more likely to feel a heightened sense of awkwardness because psychologically, you need to feel safe with someone. This is a very primitive way that our brain has been hardwired so that we can stay in groups and people that we're comfortable with so that we could survive, reproduce, all that jazz. Now, research actually does show that if you don't have the perception of awkwardness, it's kind of unhealthy. It is good to have a bit of awkwardness, and it just essentially means that you're more self-aware. Research has shown that when you're more awkward, you seem more relatable and people will tend to trust you more than if you're not awkward at all. What's interesting is that a lot of the times you will remember your most awkward moments because your brain tends to store memory with emotions. So if you have a specifically charged emotion that's associated with a particular memory, it will be stored in your brain much stronger. So if it's something that's really embarrassing, something that's awkward, you will remember it in vivid detail and probably ponder on that for longer than you should. But that's literally because your brain is just wired to remember strong emotions. So the thing about how to combat awkwardness is about shifting your perspective. So every single person on this planet has awkward moments. It's not like it only happens to you thing. It's a universal experience. No one focuses in on your awkward moments the way that you do. So we've got to just, move on quicker, continue with our lives, just accept that it happened and move on. Ways to combat this could be, number one, try not to put your hands in your pockets and have open body language when you're talking to people, as it exerts more confidence. So eye contact is a big thing here. Constant eye contact with someone makes things so much worse, but not looking at someone either is really awkward. So there has to be this balance that you're trying to achieve with eye contact. Maybe, look for a little bit, but then also look away. So it's not just like this intense, deep into your soul eye contact that you're making with someone. So try to balance your eye contact. Now, the best way to combat awkwardness, and this also ties in with social anxiety, is exposure therapy. So literally just meeting more people, being more present in conversations, not hiding or running away from having to communicate with people. Even if you're awkward, own that, and don't dwell on it for too long and let it hinder your life progress. There was also research that if people are awkward, it's fine. Not everyone has to be socially adept. And most people have so many different skill sets. And if being socially confident isn't one of them, it is fine. You have other skills, but you can always work on your confidence levels, trying to overcome your awkwardness. I remember I sent a picture to my friend recently where I saw this keychain in a store and it said majestically awkward. And I was like, honestly, this describes me and even the friend I sent it to a T. So yeah, be majestically awkward, own who you are, everything, all the awkwardness included. And yeah, thank you so much for listening to today's episode. See you in the next one. Bye. I'm gonna have to put in this soundboard sound because this is fire. Okay, bye.